no? But spinal cord localization and anatomy, that's one of the parts of the nervous system that is more challenging for residents and even for young consultants. So I would understand if you have a lot of challenges facing this case and the lecture, but spinal cord, the spinal cord I think is very, lahat naman ng parts ng nervous system important, but more so the spinal cord because it's the direct link of the body to the, to the brain stem and to the cortical structures. So you see a lot of patients with vehicular accidents who get paralyzed, paraplegic, sometimes quadriplegic. So it makes it challenging because it's a very tiny structure. But there's so much anatomy, inside that spinal cord. Sige, maybe we can present by 10:05. We'll just wait for your other classmates to log in. And for the exams, no, I would like for you to read also your Adams, but we will focus mainly on the disease entities that I have mentioned because we feel, no, the department feels these are the more important spinal cord conditions in terms of infectious and inflammatory. No, and the vascular, it's rare, it's very rare to see spinal cord infarctions, but in the offhand chance it does happen. But what we see here mostly in the Philippines would be Pott's disease and the different kinds of epidural abscesses, no? And because of the increasing or the increased amounts or increased numbers of HIV patients in the Philippines, TB and the different bacterial and fungal infections that may involve the nervous system are very challenging conditions. Sige, you can start anytime.
Okay, good morning po, Doc. We'll start na po. Okay, good morning, everyone. We're from Group C4, and we will be discussing case 14 today under the topic of inflammatory and infectious diseases of the spinal cord. Next slide, please. Okay, to start, we have a 21-year-old female patient, right-handed with no known comorbidities, who is complaining of back pain of 7 months duration. The patient herself is the informant with good reliability.
7 months prior to admission, patient noted upper back pain with a pain scale of 3 to 5/10, described as dull, mild to moderate in nature, aggravated on both rest and movements, especially on bending forward or twisting, and is partially relieved with paracetamol 500 milligrams per tab, one tablet taken as needed. Patient was associated with morning stiffness lasting for 30 to 40 minutes and night pain causing sleeping difficulties. No medical consult was done and condition was tolerated. 5 months prior to admission, condition persisted with same characteristics, but with increased pain intensity between scale of 5 to 8 over 10 and now associated with occasional low-grade fever with evening rise of temperature and night sweats. Patient also complained about anorexia and weight loss but was not documented. Her bowel bladder habit was normal. She had occasional lightheadedness, palpitation, and easy fatigability, and no medical consult was done and condition was tolerated.
Recording in progress.
There, there was no history of cough, chest pain, chest tightness, blood mixed sputum, breathlessness, abnormal sensation to limbs, limb weakness, walking difficulty, low back pain, other bone or joint pain, burning micturition, abdominal pain, any abnormal mass growth, skin lesion, recent trauma, malar rash, photosensitivity, oral ulcer, contact with known TB patient, blood loss, heat or cold intolerance, recent traveling to any specific fever endemic zone and promiscuity. 4 months prior to admission, due to persistence of conditions, the patient was advised to seek a medical consult to which she visited several physicians on an outpatient basis and took unrecalled medications leading to partial response. 2 weeks prior to admission, patient noted progressive weakness of both lower extremities, in which she becomes wheelchair-bound since then. She also reported numbness and tingling sensation in bilateral lower extremities. Due to the recurrency of her condition and increasing intensity of upper back pain to 7 to 9 over 10, she opted to seek consult at the emergency department of our institution.
So the patient was previously in functional class 1 with no known comorbidities and no history of prior hospitalizations or surgical procedures. She has no history of previous pulmonary tuberculosis, infection, or treatment, and completed all routine childhood vaccinations. She has also received 2 doses of the Moderna COVID-19 vaccine. There is no history of recurrent infections during childhood.
For the family history, there is breast cancer in the maternal side, lung cancer in the paternal side, with no hypertension or type 2 diabetes mellitus.
Per personal and social history, the patient does not smoke and does not consume alcohol, and she denies any illicit drug use, and she reported having only one sexual partner of the opposite sex.
For the review of systems, the only remarkable one is yung general po, which the patient experienced weight loss and sweating and weakness, while all the other organ systems are unremarkable.
For the patient's physical examination, what is remarkable are sa extremities. There is the presence of mild thoracic kyphosis, grade 2 tender T4 to T5 area, a palpable gibbous, active forward bending and rotation were painful but not restricted.
On mental status examination, the patient is awake and alert with good regard. She is well groomed with hair well kept and is appropriately dressed for her age. She exhibits a euthymic mood with appropriate and congruent effect. On assessment of frontal lobe functions, the patient demonstrates good insight and judgment with an appropriate fund of knowledge. Attention and concentration are intact. On temporal lobe examination, the patient is oriented to time, place, and person with intact, immediate, recent, and remote memory. On parietal lobe assessment, there is no right-left disorientation, no acalcula, no agraphia, and no finger agnosia. There is also no evidence of neglect, body part agnosia, or constructional ideomotor or dressing apraxia. On occipital lobe examination, the patient is able to correctly identify colors and objects, so Overall, the mental status examination is unremarkable, indicating intact higher and cortical function.
Continuing with the neurologic exam, so for the cranial nerve examination, results are unremarkable, suggesting intact cranial nerves. But the question is why CN examination is still of high clinical significance when presented with a patient complaining of chronic back pain. So we can say that doing the cranial nerve exam here is more of a localization tool. So we are specifically looking for evidence that the pathology is not limited uh, to spine and there could be an intracranial or brainstem involved. Hence, this cranial nerve exam is normal cranial nerve exam is as informative as an abnormal CN exam results.
To continue, for the muscle stretch reflexes, the bicep, triceps, and brachioradialis reflexes of the bilateral upper extremities were noted to be normal, while the patellar and ankle reflexes of the bilateral lower extremities were noted to be absent.
For the cerebellar exam, our patient has no nystagmus, no dysmetria on finger-to-nose test, and no dysdiadochokinesia. For pathologic reflexes, our patient has no clonus or Babinski. And for the meninges, our patient is negative for nuchal rigidity, Brudzinski, and Koenig sign.
With regard to the workup and diagnostics, so the complete blood count of the patient reveals that there is a hemoglobin count of 97, hematocrit of 24, WBC of 6.9, neutrophils of 68, lymphocytes of 29, monocytes 2, eosinophils 1, basophils 1, stab cells 0, and platelet count of 364. And then we proceed to the findings of chest X-ray. Next
Wait,
slide.
before you proceed with the chest X-ray, do you think that CBC is unremarkable or normal?
The There may be some abnormalities, Doc, with regard to the complete blood count, Doc.
So what is that abnormality?
The hemoglobin count, Doc, is quite low because the normal values of hemoglobin is hold on, medyo may so Doc, yung sa hemoglobin po, it's relatively low since the normal values are 120 to 160 grams per liters. And then yung sa hematocrit po, mababa din. Kasi usually yung normal values po would be 37 to 47%. Tapos yung...
Go
Yes
ahead,
po.
go ahead.
And then yun lang po yung mga remarkable po sa CBC, Doc.
Yeah. So it would be it's common to see like when patients have chronic complaints, no, diba? Because this is a 7-month history. So you can appreciate sometimes that like hemoglobin is like this. It may not be directly related to your case, but indirectly if you have like, chronic progressive disease or chronic illness, then you would have anemia, specifically the iron deficiency or the anemia of chronic illness. So just asking because all of these things as third-year students, you have to, although this is neurology, you have to correlate everything that you see on the laboratories and your PE and your neuro exam with your case. Thank you. Go ahead.
And then as we move forward, so the next slide would show the chest X-ray of the patient, and the findings of the X-ray showed that there is a suspicious narrowing on the T4, T5 area, And then other abnormalities were not noted in both lung fields. So the narrowing could be seen by the red arrow pointed on the right side of the X-ray slide po.
Next, for the MRI of the thoracic spine with contrast, the findings revealed kyphosis at T4 to T5 level suggestive of Pott's disease involving T4 to T5 vertebrae with significant spinal canal stenosis. Next slide, please. For the CT-guided FNUB, it showed granulomatous inflammation with no malignant cells seen, and the tuberculin test revealed a positive result.
Okay, so let us now proceed with the localization of the lesion. So based on the pertinent neurological findings, the patient's mental status examination was unremarkable, indicating an intact cortical function. The cranial nerve examination was likewise unremarkable, suggesting a preserved brainstem function. Cerebellar examination showed no abnormalities, indicating an intact cerebellar function. The meningeal examination was also unremarkable with no signs of meningeal irritation, and these findings suggest that the lesion is most likely located below the level of the brain, as both the supratentorial and infratentorial structures, as well as the meninges, appear to be intact. Next slide, please.
For the motor exam, findings are reduced muscle bulk and tone with no spasticity, 3/5 grading of motor strength on bilateral lower extremity. For muscle stretch reflexes, they're absent patellar and ankle reflexes, while pathological reflexes are absent, like no clonus and no Babinski sign. So all of these are suggestive of lower motor neuron signs. Next slide. For the sensory exam, there is reduced pain, temperature, and crude touch to 80% at the level of T6 dermatome downwards, meaning the spinothalamic pathways is affected. And then there is also impaired vibratory and position sense on both lower extremities, meaning the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway is also affected. Next slide.
Okay, the patient also reported pain elicited by both active and passive range of motion of the back, which localizes the pain source to mechanically stressed spinal structures, such as the vertebrae, among others. And this supports a structural or an inflammatory spinal pathology, which favors an extrinsic compressive process rather than a purely intrinsic spinal cord lesion. And a finding of a negative straight leg raise test also makes lumbosacral radiculopathy and disc herniation as an unlikely cause of the bilateral lower extremity findings. Next slide, please. So as mentioned earlier, sensory examination demonstrated reduced pain, temperature, and crude touch sensation at the T6 dermatome and below. So since there is a presence of a clear sensory level, this strongly localizes the lesion also to the spinal cord. And we have here a location at the thoracic spinal cord. And we have here the location at the level of T4 and T5, given that spinothalamic fibers ascend approximately 1 to 2 spinal segments before decusating. So a T6 sensory level would correspond anatomically to a lesion at the T4 to T5 spinal cord level. And putting this all together, the findings of, as mentioned, the T6 sensory level, bilateral lower extremity weakness, involvement of all major tracts, the spinothalamic, DCML, and corticospinal, and as well as the lower motor neuron signs earlier, preserved cortical and brainstem function, and key findings of thoracic kyphosis and palpable gibbous deformity also around the T4, T5 area. And lastly, the mechanical back pain that is reported by the patient. We can summarize or localize the lesion to a most likely a chronic transverse process involving the thoracic spinal cord at the T4, T5 level that is consistent with a structural or inflammatory compressive spinal pathology. Next slide, please.
With the information given, our primary impression can be Pott's disease or spinal tuberculosis involving the T4, T5 with compressive thoracic myelopathy. Next slide, please. So, based on the history and PE, first, the patient has progressive upper back pain for 7 months. This long indolent course is typical of tuberculosis rather than mechanical or pyogenic causes, which usually progress more rapidly. The patient also has classical constitutional symptoms of tuberculosis, including low-grade fever, night sweats, anorexia, weight loss, lightheadedness, palpitations, and easy fatigability. These symptoms strongly suggest a chronic infectious process such as extrapulmonary tuberculosis. Then neurologically, she developed progressive weakness of both lower extremities, eventually becoming wheelchair-bound. On examination, she has 3 to 5 motor strength in both legs, sensory loss below the T6 dermatome, impaired vibration position sense, and absent knee and ankle reflexes. She also reports numbness and tingling in both lower extremities. These findings indicate thoracic spinal cord compression, which is a known complication of advanced Pott's disease. On physical examination, she has mild thoracic kyphosis and palpable gibbous. These deformities occur when tuberculosis destroys the anterior portions of the vertebral bodies, causing collapse and angular kyphosis, which is characteristic of Pott's disease.
So to continue, some of the pertinent findings that we considered based on the diagnostic workups include the following. So for the chest X-ray, it was noted that there was suspicious narrowing of the T4 to T5 area. Otherwise, no abnormalities were noted in both the lung fields. But despite the normal lung findings, this does not rule out active spinal TB, and suspicious narrowing of the vertebral bodies suggests a destructive spinal pathology. On MRI, it was also noted that there was kyphosis at the T4 to T5 level, which is suggestive of Pott's disease involving the T4 to T5 vertebrae with significant spinal canal stenosis. So these findings are characteristic of Pott's disease. And then on CT-guided FNAB, granulomatous inflammation was seen, which is again a significant finding as granulomas are a histologic hallmark of tuberculosis. And then lastly, for the positive tuberculin test, this indicates previous exposure to mycobacterium tuberculosis. So overall, the diagnostic findings further support the history and physical examination findings of the patient, which strongly suggests spinal tuberculosis or Pott's disease.
Okay. So in the Philippines, Pott's disease is considered endemic because the country remains a high tuberculosis burden setting, where tuberculosis continues to be a leading cause of infectious morbidity and mortality. Sustained community transmission of Mycobacterium tuberculosis contributes to the relatively high occurrence of extrapulmonary tuberculosis, including spinal involvement. The endemicity of spinal tuberculosis reflects persistent challenges such as crowded urban living conditions, socioeconomic disparities, delayed access to healthcare, and underdiagnosis, all of which facilitate hematogenous spread from primary or latent pulmonary foci. So although spinal tuberculosis may occur in immunocompetent individuals, the risk is increased because among populations with malnutrition, diabetes mellitus, HIV infections, and other immunocompromising conditions, despite national tuberculosis control efforts, the Pott's disease remains a clinically significant cause of chronic back pain, spinal deformity, and neurologic complications.
So POTS disease develops following a hematogenous dissemination. Next slide, please. Yeah, next slide. Okay, so the POTS disease develops following a hematogenous dissemination of Mycobacterium tuberculosis from a primary focus, most commonly the lungs, to the highly vascular cancellous bone of the vertebral bodies. So the infection typically localizes in the anterior portion of the vertebral body near the subchondral plate, where the bacilli trigger a delayed type or type 4 hypersensitivity reaction. So this immune response leads to the formation of caseating granulomas composed of epithelioid cells, Langhans giant cells, and lymphocytes, resulting in progressive destruction of vertebral bone. So as the disease progresses, contiguous spread to the adjacent vertebra occurs through the involvement of the intervertebral disc, secondary to end plate destruction, leading to vertebral body collapse, anterior wedging, and angular kyphosis. So the accumulation of the caseous necrotic material may extend beneath the anterior longitudinal ligament or along the fascial planes, forming paravertebral or psoas cold abscesses, often in the absence of marked systemic signs of infection. So next slide, please. So the neurological complications of POTS disease. So the neurologic complications arise when the spinal canal compromise occurs due to a combination of epidural granulation tissue, abscess formation, vertebral collapse, and mechanical instability. So these processes results in the compression of the spinal cord or nerve roots, manifesting as progressive motor weakness, sensory deficits, and autonomic dysfunction. In addition, vascular compromise from end arteritis obliterans of spinal arteries may contribute to the spinal cord ischemia, further exacerbating neurologic impairment.
Okay, so the group prepared 5 differentials, one of which is the vertebral bacterial osteomyelitis or VBO. So for the our considerations of ruling in, first would be the patient's chronic back pain for 7 months. So VBO typically presents with persistent localized spinal pain. And then the patient also has pain that worsens with movement and at night. So this is also consistent with the inflammatory involvement of the vertebral bodies. And then the patient presents with localized vertebral tenderness, particularly in the T4 to T5 area. So focal spinal tenderness supports vertebral infection. And then the patient also presents with low-grade fever and night pain, and VBO may present with these subtle systemic symptoms. And then for MRI, her MRI shows vertebral body involvement with canal stenosis. And then for the reasons that we rule out VBO, it's because the patient is young. She's 21 and she's also immunocompetent with no comorbidities. So VBO is more commonly present in older or advanced age people or in immunocompromised patients. And then there is also presence of a granulomatous inflammation on her FNOB, which likely favors a tuberculosis infection rather than VBO. And then there's also a positive tuberculin test, which again supports TB exposure, not VBO. And then kyphosis and gibbous deformity, which is again classic for TB, spondylitis, and uncommon for VBO. And then thoracic spine involvement is present. So VBO is most commonly involving the lumbar spine. So thoracic involvement is again more typical of TB. And then there's indolent course over 7 months. So VBO is usually subacute. TB has slow progressive course. And then lastly, there's no bacteremia source and no leukocytosis. So VBO has a hematogenous source and elevated inflammatory markers. And then for the next differentials,
So for the next differential, we considered ankylosing spondylitis, which is an inflammatory spondyloarthropathy that can present with chronic back pain. It may initially resemble Pott's disease, particularly in the early stages before classic imaging findings um, appear in the patient. The condition commonly affects younger patients, which is one of our reasons for ruling it in, typically under 40 years old and presents with chronic back pain lasting more than 3 months. The patient often reports morning back stiffness and pain that is aggravated or worse with rest or inactivity and improves with movement, which is characteristic of inflammatory back pain. Associated symptoms may include fatigue and, in more advanced cases, thoracic kyphosis due to the progressive spinal involvement. However, ankylosing spondylitis becomes less likely when features suggest an infectious process rather than inflammatory. So our patient has pain that is aggravated by activity or exercise rather than relieved by it, which argues against ankylosing spondylitis. In addition, constitutional symptoms such as fever, weight loss, and night sweats are not typical of ankylosing spondylitis and instead raise concern for spinal tuberculosis. A positive tuberculin skin test and progressive lower extremity weakness also further support the Pott's disease diagnosis. For our next differential,
So one important differential also we considered is spinal epidural abscess because the patient has elements of the classic triad including the chronic back pain, episodes of fever associated with night sweats, and progressive neurologic deficits, particularly worsening bilateral lower extremity weakness and numbness with tingling sensation. She also reports fatigability, anorexia, and unintentional weight loss, which are consistent with chronic infection. MRI shows significant spinal canal stenosis at the T4 to T5 level, and on PE, there is localized spinal tenderness over the same area, raising concern for a compressive spinal pathology. However, spinal epidural abscess is less likely in this patient because her course is very chronic at 7 months, whereas epidural abscess typically evolves over days to weeks. Also, her tuberculin test is positive, suggesting a tuberculous rather than a pyogenic etiology, and she did not present with an acute septic picture as she was afebrile and hemodynamically stable on admission and with no leukocytosis and a normal white blood WBC count. Fine needle aspiration biopsy also revealed granulomatous rather than a pyogenic inflammation, and there is no history of trauma, spinal surgery, or skin infection to suggest bacteremia. Lastly, there are no meningeal signs with negative Kernig and Brosinski test done. For our next differential,
Okay, so primary spinal lymphoma was considered because the patient has progressive thoracic back pain with night pain, associated weight loss, night sweats, anemia, and progressive bilateral lower extremity weakness with impaired pain and temperature sensation below the T6 dermatome. The MRI demonstrated spinal canal stenosis at T4 to T5, raising concern for a spinal space occupying process. However, several findings in this case strongly argue against primary spinal lymphoma. The patient has a low-grade fever with an evening rise of temperature, which is more characteristic of chronic infection than lymphoma. The disease course has been indolent and slowly progressive over 7 months. Then, on physical examination, she has a gibbous deformity and thoracic kyphosis, which are rarely seen in lymphoma. Imaging demonstrates intervertebral disc involvement and paravertebral inflammatory changes, favoring an infectious etiology. Then, most definitively, CT-guided fine needle aspiration biopsy revealed granulomatous inflammation with no malignant cells. The tuberculin skin test was positive. And lastly, there's no lymphadenopathy or immunosuppression, furthering lowering the likelihood of spinal lymphoma. Next slide, please.
So for the last differential that we considered, although it is quite rare, we also placed syringomyelia. The reasons for ruling it in is that the patient presented with chronic back pain, progressive leg weakness, and the history also presented that there was loss of sensitivity to pain and temperature to about 80%. And then we ruled it out because the patient History also noted that there was reduced touch and vibratory senses, as opposed to, let's say, syringomyelia, which usually preserves touch and vibratory senses. There were also cavitary granulations seen on the X-ray, which is not normally found in the said differential diagnosis. And in syringomyelia, there's also usually a cape-like distribution of loss of pain and temperature sensation. There's also manifestations of headache that the patient did not exhibit. That headache is often associated with CSF buildup. And then in terms of, let's say, diagnosing syringomyelia, which were also not seen in the patient, that's why we ruled it out. There were no cystic lesions or spinal tumors seen on the MRI, and there's no dye leaching into the syrinx cavity as seen on CT scans. So, though a possible complication of Pott's disease, it's a rare disorder again, hence it could be safely ruled out.
So, so now let's move on to the diagnostic plan. For the laboratory studies, complete blood count to evaluate signs of infection or systemic inflammation. Next would be erythrocyte sedimentation rate. This is a non-specific marker for inflammation and infection, and we expect a markedly elevated result in tuberculosis infection or malignancy. Next would be the TB screening test, specifically tuberculin skin test, also called as the Mantoux test, to support prior TB exposure. But this is an adjunctive test only as it cannot distinguish between latent TB from active disease.
So continuing with our diagnostic plan, several microbiological studies could be requested to confirm the diagnosis of Pott's disease. So first, we can request for AFP staining. So this provides rapid but presumptive evidence only of Mycobacterium tuberculosis. Although it has limited sensitivity in extrapulmonary tuberculosis, a positive result would strongly support the diagnosis. Next, we could also request for microbacterial culture. And even though this takes time to be done, this remains to be the gold standard for confirming Mycobacterium tuberculosis. In addition to establishing the diagnosis, it also allows for drug susceptibility testing, which is essential for guiding appropriate anti-tuberculous therapy. Next, we can also employ PCR testing using GeneXpert assay. This is a rapid nucleic acid amplification test that can simultaneously detect TB and identify any rifampicin resistance, allowing for early diagnosis and timely initiation of appropriate treatment. Lastly, CT guided pine needle aspiration biopsy of vertebral lesion is performed usually to obtain tissue for pathologic and microbiologic evaluation. In cases of spinal tuberculosis, remember that direct tissue sampling provides higher diagnostic yield rather than sputum-based testing. Typical pathologic findings we can see include granulomatous inflammation with caseation and associated abscess formation, which supports the diagnosis while helping ruling out any malignancy or pyogenic infection. Next slide, please.
Next, moving on to the imaging studies that can be done to diagnose Pott's disease. First, we have MRI of the thoracic spine, which was already performed in this case. It is the modality of choice as it detects the extent of soft tissue enhancement, the location of the abscess, and spinal canal compromise. It also detects spinal inflammation resulting to spinal canal stenosis and shows the affectation of the vertebral body and disc, as well as the compression of the spine. We also included bone scintigraphy that assesses for increased uptake at the thoracic area that corresponds to active inflammation or infection. It is also useful in multifocal or skip lesions. We also included chest X-ray to help rule out pulmonary conditions and also assess the extent of the infection.
So for the management or the treatment plan for POTS disease, so the primary goals of therapy are first is to eradicate the etiologic agent, which is the Mycobacterium tuberculosis, through adequate and prolonged antimicrobial therapy. Second is to prevent complications, which include spinal deformity, functional impairment, neurologic deficits such as spinal cord compression, and also disease relapse. And third, to facilitate functional recovery through appropriate rehabilitation once the infection is adequately controlled, especially in patients with spinal involvement. So the cornerstone of treatment of POTS disease is prolonged multi-drug antimicrobial therapy. So the general principles of treatment are somewhat similar to those used in pulmonary tuberculosis. However, a longer duration of therapy is often required in musculoskeletal TB due to several important factors, which is due to poor penetration of anti-tuberculosis or tuberculous drugs into bone and joint tissue, due to slow clinical and radiologic resolution of lesions, and due to higher risk of relapse and residual deformity, particularly in spinal diseases. Next slide, please. So for drug susceptible infection, the World Health Organization recommended standard regimen for spinal, bone, and CNS tuberculosis, which consists of 12 months of therapy. So for the initiation or intensive phase, this is during the first 2 months, the patient will receive the 4 first-line anti-tuberculous drugs, which are the isoniazid, rifampicin, pyrazinamide, and ethambutol. So this combination aims to rapidly reduce the mycobacterial burden and prevent the emergence of drug resistance. Streptomycin may also be used in selected cases, although it is now less commonly included due to toxicity concerns and the availability of effective oral agents. So after the 2 months therapy, this is followed by a continuation phase of 10 months using the two first-line agent, which is the isoniazid and the rifampicin. So the prolonged continuation phase is particularly important in spinal tuberculosis, where healing is slow and inadequate treatment may lead to deformity or neurologic compromise. And lastly, for in cases of drug-resistant infection, the data are still limited regarding optimal regimens and duration. However, there are second-line or newer agents used to resistant cases. So first is the linozolid, which demonstrate a good penetration into bone tissue. And the second one is the bedaquiline, which has been successfully used in limited cases. It has a long half-life. However, the data on long-term outcomes in bone and joint TB are still evolving. Next slide, please.
So most cases of POTS disease are treated medically with anti-tuberculous therapy, and surgery is reserved for selected patients with complications or failure of conservative management. First, surgical intervention is indicated in cases of neurologic compromise. This includes patients with progressive or severe neurologic deficits, such as motor weakness, paraplegia, or bowel and bladder dysfunction. This finding suggests spinal cord or nerve root compression that requires urgent decompression. Second, surgery is considered when there is spinal instability, particularly when there is progressive kyphotic deformity. This is especially important if the deformity poses a risk for neurologic deterioration. Third, patients with significant spinal deformity, such as severe or worsening kyphosis, may require surgery to prevent further progression and late onset neurologic deficits. Surgery is also indicated in the presence of epidural, paraspinal, or psoas abscesses that do not respond adequately to medical therapy or percutaneous drainage, particularly if there is associated compression or persistent symptoms. Next slide. Surgery is also indicated if, despite appropriate and adequate anti-tuberculous therapy, some patients still continue to experience persistent pain, progressive deformity, or radiologic and clinical evidence of disease progression. In these cases, surgical intervention becomes necessary to control the disease and prevent further complications. Another indication is diagnostic uncertainty. Surgery may be required to obtain tissue for histopathologic and microbiologic information, particularly when initial studies are inconclusive or when drug-resistant tuberculosis is suspected. Establishing a definitive diagnosis is essential to guide appropriate therapy. Overall, the goal of surgery in Pott's disease is to relieve neural compression, stabilize the spine, and prevent long-term deformity, but always in conjunction with appropriate anti-tuberculous therapy. Next slide, please.
So for supportive management of this patient, one of our recommended management is spinal immobilization and orthosis. So what this is supposed to do is prevent further cord injury and progression of her kyphotic deformity. So one of the examples would be thoracic spinal orthosis or the TLSO brace. You can see it in the lower right of the screen. Also, there's spinal offloading. So most of this is avoidance of forward bending, twisting, and heavy lifting, and also bed rest. Next, we have initial activity restriction. So this is important, especially post-operatively, because this can minimize injury and promote healing and stabilization of the patient. So for physical therapy and neurorehabilitation, this would prevent muscle wasting of the patient and pressure injuries and deconditioning. So examples of this are passive and active range of motion exercises, lower extremity strengthening exercises. So this is important given that the patient has bilateral lower extremity strength of 3/5. And we also have gait training. Next slide. Next, we have prevention of complications of immobility. So in our case, the patient is known to be wheelchair bound. So she's at risk for developing deep vein thrombosis and pressure sores. So to prevent deep vein thrombosis, we can give her compression stockings or pharmacologicals like oral anticoagulants like apixaban or other low molecular weight heparins. For pressure sores, to prevent this, we can tell her to have frequent repositioning. And lastly, what's also important is close follow-up and evaluation. So first, neurologic monitoring. So we have to keep track of her lower extremity strength, her sensory level, her reflexes. For radiologic monitoring, including MRI and X-ray, laboratory monitoring, and also orthopedic monitoring. Next slide.
So for the prognosis, the following factors are as follows. So for complicated disease, those associated deformities, instabilities, or neurological deficits. It also includes age, like the extremes. So old age or younger age, immunodeficiency, such as conditions of HIV, alcohol or drug abuse, malnutrition, overcrowding, and poverty, and then compliance of the patient to the treatment, such as their drug intolerance or liver dysfunction. Next slide, please. So for this patient, the prognosis is generally favorable due to her young age, absence of comorbidities, and immunocompetence. However, caution is still strongly advised due to the compressive thoracic myelopathy, kyphotic deformity at the level of T4 and D5, and prolonged symptom duration of 7 months. So, caution is strongly advised because these conditions increases the risk of permanent deficits on the thoracic spinal cord. With this, prompt and adequate management is needed to guide towards the most favorable neurological outcome. Next slide, please.
So prognosis could also be based on the clinical radiological features. So for this patient, since we have a T4 to T5 kyphosis, we can classify them as stage 3 or with mild angular kyphosis. So this is described as 2 to 3 vertebrae involved and a kyphosis of 10 to 30 degrees. with a usual disease duration of 3 to 9 months. Next slide, please. So for additional information, here are the other poor prognostic factors for POTS disease. So we have the level of disease, particularly at the junctional vertebral levels, an extensive vertebral involvement, a long duration, rapid progression, or severe neurological deficits, the type of spinal compression, whether this is an abscess or a granuloma, and the presence of spinal cord changes. Meanwhile, poor prognostic factors for deformity progression include an age of younger than 10 years old, kyphosis of more than 30 degrees, involvement of 3 or more vertebrae, and a vertebral body loss of more than or equal to 1.5. Again, extensive vertebral involvement and spinal instability.
So for the complications of POTS disease, it includes failure of treatment, abscess formation, neurological deficits, spinal instability, spinal deformity, and systemic tuberculosis. Next slide, please. So here are our references. Thank you for your attention, and this concludes the report for case 14.
Thank you. I'd like to commend the group for a very extensive discussion on POTS disease. So just a few pointers now. When I was making your slides, I made sure that we had a review. I hope I'm sorry for the late submission, but I wanted to improve on it. So I included like a review of spinal cord anatomy and localization. What I failed to include pala when I realized is the distinction between extramedullary and intramedullary. So I'm sure that you've been practicing localization and you know that there's no there's no one way of doing it. There's so many ways that we can do it, but at the same time, there are so many aspects that we look at. So it's not just cervical cord, thoracic cord, it's also extramedullary versus intramedullary. It's also white matter versus gray matter. And then you have the different cord syndromes. What else? And then you have the different ascending, descending pathways. So, i-share ko lang just to show to you. Because when we see a patient like this patient, no, we talk about back pain. Kasi back pain yung pinaka how do you call it, prominent, before all the weakness started, it was back pain that was prominent. So as if you put yourself in the mindset of a neurology resident, dali lang, sara ko lang yung pinto, wait lang, give me a moment. So if you put yourself in the perspective of a neurology resident, because this is a paper case, you had the MRI and all the labs, but think about it, no, just visualize, for example, you saw this patient either in the outpatient clinic for the first time or the emergency room for the first time, and you are left to your wits and to your stock knowledge as to how to, number one, diba, answer the question, where is the lesion? And number two, answer the question, what is the lesion? So in terms of where is the lesion, anything that, what are your clues to thinking that this is spinal cord? Syempre on the history, back pain. And then, of course, paraplegia. If you have paraplegia and you have a sensory level, talaga namang, you're in terms of like, di ba, in my lecture on localization, I always tell my students, localization is just really finding the exact address that you have to go, of a house that you have to go to or a place that you have to go to. So when you have, let's say, paraplegia and in a sensory level, that already puts you at the spinal cord as one of your focus of localization. Whether or not there's some other focus, then that's left for you to figure out in the other parts of the neuro exam. But the spinal level, a sensory level, and then paraplegia below or paraparesis should already make you think, spinal cord to. So once you figure out, okay, you have a spinal level, you have a sensory level, where is it? What tracts are specifically involved? Does it involve motor? Does it involve sensory? Specifically, when it comes to sensory, dalawa lang naman yan eh. Are my Is sensation involved? Is pain involved? Is light touch involved? Because if it is yes, okay, good. Is position sense involved? Is vibratory sense involved? If lahat yan involved, then you're looking at something like almost complete chord. Or, something complete or incomplete. So, ganun natin siya titignan. And when it comes to etiologies and localization, another question that's asked, okay, if it is spinal cord, is it extramedullary or intramedullary? I'll share with you this slide lang. I just put it together just today kasi na-realize ko, I forgot to put extramedullary and intramedullary. Can you see this slide? Okay, because when it comes to spinal cord, your question is the problem inside, originating from the inside of the spinal cord, or is it originating from the outside of the spinal cord? If you didn't think that this was TB, no, if you didn't have the luxury of your MRI and your other tests, what will make you think whether it is extramedullary or intramedullary? For neurology trainees, especially for residents, this comes in particular importance and significance because it can narrow down already your etiology. TB doesn't really grow intramedullary. Gets nyo? Parang it's usually and most of the time extramedullary. So one of the core features that makes you think it's extramedullary is pain. When you have pain as one of your symptoms na mas severe and progressive, then you can think it is extramedullary, especially if it is asymmetrical, if it starts one leg, then the other leg, or one arm, then the other arm, then that can point to an asymmetrical, an extramedullary lesion. What else? Motor symptoms also can point more to extramedullary lesion. And remember the lamellation, di ba? Sacral, lumbar, thoracic, cervical. What else? Sensory manifestations are usually ascending if it is an extramedullary lesion. But there are exceptions to the rule, but in general, it is like this. And autonomics involvement, specifically the sphincters, usually are late involvement for extramedullary lesion. So, if you didn't appreciate a gibbous deformity, then isipin mo, intramedullary ba to, extramedullary? But already, if you see the back is like bent like that, that's another clue to localization na, this might be extramedullary. So for me, what makes me look at extramedullary versus intramedullary would be this: ascending numbness, ascending weakness, early weakness, and back pain as one of the most prominent symptoms, and later involvement of the urinary and the defecation components. So because in your history you said that there's motor weakness, and then your dorsal column and your dorsal column and your spinothalamics are involved, then this is the table this is the picture that you would want to look at. So this complete cord transection. Is this hemichord? You wouldn't be thinking, I know in one of your differential it was syringomyelia, but your patient presents with something like this, rather than this one or this one. So you can easily, like, just by localization alone, you might even you won't even really consider syringomyelia because your patient's level starts here. So just by looking at the presentation, no? And hindi ka rin mag-iisip ng posterior cord because with posterior cord, it would be your vibratory and joint position sense and 2-point discrimination that would be more affected. So you can rule this out, yung mga tabes dorsalis and all that. And you can also rule out anterior cord affectation lang because everything below is affected, no? Any questions so far? You can raise your hands anytime, ha? Another point, Another point that I would like to look at would be when you're saying, di ba dun sa lecture, spinal epidural abscess is so closely opposed to TB. So aside from vertebral osteomyelitis, you can actually have epidural abscess that is tuberculous in nature. So if it were me, in like if you look okay, and when you do your differential diagnosis, di ba you have your primary differential, the very first, the most plausible diagnosis that you can think of. And then when you rule it down, yung 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 ninyo, then kung ano yung pinaka how do you say it? Kung ano yung pinaka possible, yun yung susunod. So, I would have put there vertebral, yeah, Pott's disease, and then spinal epidural abscess. That is TB in origin. Do you understand? Why? Because the epidural space is so closely opposed to the vertebrae. Tama? So that would have been that would have been my number 2 differential diagnosis. Yes, Dr. Rivera, you're raising your hand. Ay, hindi pala. Kamay ko pala yun. So sorry. Sorry. And then, okay, you mentioned also, konti na lang points. You mentioned also TB, no? So, okay, in the classification of TB, there are only 2 things. It's either pulmonary TB or extrapulmonary TB. Everything else out of the lungs is considered, it's grouped together in this big group of classification called extrapulmonary TB. So whether it is TB meningitis, it is Pott disease or Pott's disease, it's considered extrapulmonary TB. And in general, if pulmonary TB is given like 6 months of treatment, anything extrapulmonary has to take longer in treatment because of the absorption time and all that. And mula nung estudyante ako hanggang ngayon, the treatment has is still the same, no? It's the quadruple or triple quadruple anti-TB treatment. But nowadays it's more convenient to give it in the multiple drug tablet. Dati, when we were younger, there were, it's still available, the separate tablets, but now it's really more convenient to just give the Quad Tab or the Myrin P Forte and all that. So when it comes to CNS, ito na lang, because we're in neurology, when you have any affectation of any part of your nervous system with TB, the standard treatment is what? 10 months, 10 to 12 months, 1 year. Okay, 1 year of treatment, 2 years, 2 months on the intensive phase and the rest for the maintenance phase. O, tama, 2 months intensive, 10 months na treatment. So, you were mentioning also on the the gene expert. So, when I was a student, like all of you, we just had the routine CSF analysis, the AFB smear, the TB culture, etc. But nowadays, the gene expert has slowly become part of the routine CSF analysis when you're considering TB meningitis. So let me just share to you how toxic it is to have an MDR TB patient. I don't know if it's the misfortune but I've had the experience of having a CNS infection TB patient. She's a 25, 26-year-old female from a BPO company who complains of headaches for the past 3 weeks when I saw her in another clinic in another hospital. But what surprised me was this patient came already from a very, very big tertiary hospital. 3 linggo nang sumasakit ang ulo, hindi na-work up ng maayos. It was claimed as migraine, it was claimed as whatever, but if you look at the history of the patient, the headaches were unrelenting, every day, progressive, worsening. There was no fever, just a feverish sensation. There were no other symptoms like diplopia, but of course she felt fatigued and weak and all that. But what surprised me was that this very big institution also has a neurology training program. So when I saw this patient, she had nuchal rigidity. So I had her admitted in UE because in the other hospital I felt there are no neuro residents. Mukhang kailangan bantayan. But anyway, so TB meningitis was the first consideration. And it was really TB meningitis. And then the resident tells me, "Ma'am, the gene expert is positive." And I said, in all our TB, in all our, in most, let's say in 100 out of 100 na TB meningitis in the brain, this is I would say this is the very first time I encountered MDR-TB in an immunocompetent patient because we had HIV testing done. And then, so immediately when that came out, I said, okay, I needed help. We need an IDS, we need infectious disease service here because the treatment regimen, as you mentioned, is toxic. And so in the Philippines, so hindi pala, okay, just to share to all of you, if you haven't had experience with MDR-TB, the medications for MDR-TB, the regimen, no, except for levofloxacin, they are not available commercially. So they have to be taken or they have to be procured from the TB dots. Do you know the dot centers, the TB dot centers? Okay. So in MDR-TB, hindi pala siya simple. So what happened was, with the coordination of the IDS service, the patient was referred initially to San Lazaro because the IDS service was saying it's the nearest from UERM. So the family member, the sister, went to TB Dots of San Lazaro. The most, it's one of the big hubs. And then TB Dots San Lazaro said, no, we will refer you to the nearest TB dot center where you live. So she lived in Pasig. So she was referred to the TB dot center in Pinagbuhatan, Pasig. And it doesn't, it doesn't end. There's a lot of paperwork because you really have to prove that this patient is MDR-TB. So eventually, the sister went to Pinagbuhatan. So what does that mean? Every day na pinoprocess yung referral means a delay in the treatment for the patient. Because, just to segue, when the patient was diagnosed with TB meningitis, I in all my ignorance, I wanted to start her on the quadruple anti-TB treatment that was available while we were waiting for the other meds to come in. But the IDS service said, "Ma'am, if we do that, then we can make her more prone pa to resistance." Kasi resistant na nga siya to start with what is the gene expert test resistance to rifampicin. So resistant na siya to start with rifampicin. If we give her the usual dose, it might boost her resistance even more. So alam mo yun, I felt so sad. I felt so scared actually for this patient because time is brain, and this patient has already had TB meningitis for the past 3 weeks, and I felt like I couldn't give her steroids. 'Di ba? Part ng treatment ng TB, even for pot disease, is steroids. I couldn't give her that because I couldn't give any antibiotic. So it was just mannitol and praying. So eventually, nadala sa Pinagbuhatan. So this patient was referred to Pinagbuhatan. So it doesn't end like that. So once you submit the request or the referral for treatment, there is a committee. There is a committee for MDR-TB that meets once a week, every week, to discuss new patients and difficult patients. So she is considered in that difficult patient because number one, ang sabi sa akin ng IDS, "Ma'am, very rare ang MDR-TB na TB meningitis na immunocompetent." In fact, one of our residents presented that, made a case report for that, and it was accepted in the in the local convention of the PISMID, or the Philippine Society of Microbiology and Infectious Disease. So that's how big a deal this patient was, because you don't see it all the time. So anyway, na-discuss na, eventually, the medications were made available. And the good thing naman is when the TB Dots gives the medications, they give it for 1 month. So can you imagine how expensive it is? They have levofloxacin, they have bedaquiline, and then they have linezolid, pero in tablet form. And then there are 2 other medications I can't remember, but they are all very toxic. So, ang binabantayan maigi dito sa patient na ito, is liver. So this patient, and finally, so because she's from Bicol, after like a month, she was improving eh. She was improving, and then after a month, she asked permission. Sabi niya, ma'am, my parents want me to live na lang in Bicol para it's less stressful and all that. And in my mind, yes, ma-unload ko siya dun sa friend ko na neuro kasi ang toxic niya. But yeah, so that's how MDR-TB treatment goes in our country. It is available, but there is like the red tape that you have to do, so that alam nyo na next time if you have family members or kamag-anak or neighbors na ganyan yung kailangan, that's the process that we have to go through. All right? Any questions? Wala. So I hope you continue. I hope you find interest in neurology, because it's all about your brains at the end of the day. You know, if you figure out how your body is working, you'll figure out neurology. Okay, if there are no questions, we can call it a morning. You can have your lunch already. And see you in the wards. Thank you.
Thank you po, Doc.
Bye.